Imagine this. You're driving down a desolate road in Alaska, the kind where the only light comes from your headlights and the occasional flicker of stars through the dense trees. It's late, well past midnight, and the stillness outside is suffocating. Suddenly, something darts across the road ahead. At first, it looks like a small animal, maybe a fox or an otter, but there's something off about the way it moves. It glides more than it runs, its shadow long and twisting in your headlights. You shake your head, telling yourself it's just your imagination, the darkness playing tricks on your mind. But then you hear it, a voice. Help me. It's faint, barely above a whisper, but it's there. Help me, the voice says again, this time a little louder, a little closer. Your heart pounds as you roll down the window, straining to hear. The voice is soft, almost pleading, and it sounds like a woman in distress. Against every instinct screaming at you to keep driving, you stop the car, grab a flashlight, and step into the cold night air. The voice draws you toward the trees, the beam of your flashlight bouncing off the thick trunks and underbrush. I'm here, the voice says, clearer now, but there's no one in sight. You move deeper into the woods, the cold seeping into your bones, the darkness pressing in around you. The voice grows louder, closer, until it feels like it's all around you. Then you see it, just beyond the reach of your flashlight, standing by a riverbank. At first, it looks like an otter. It's small, hunched and wet, with its back turned to you. But then it stands up. The creature's body stretches unnaturally tall, its limbs long and sinewy, its fur glistening in the moonlight. Its head tilts as it turns to face you, and your breath catches. Its face is wrong, part animal, part human, with glowing eyes that pierce through the darkness and lock onto yours. You're frozen, unable to move, your body trembling as it steps closer. The voice comes again, now clearer than ever. Help me. You've just met the Kushtaka. The Kushtaka, or land otter people, are legendary shapeshifters in Tlingit folklore. For centuries, the indigenous people of Alaska have warned about these creatures, describing them as tricksters who mimic human voices to lure their victims into the wilderness. But they're more than mischievous. They're dangerous. It's said the Kushtaka don't just harm their victims physically, they steal their souls, trapping them in limbo forever. These stories aren't just ancient myths whispered around campfires. Even today, people in Alaska report encounters with something they can't explain, something that fits the chilling description of the Kushtaka. One of the most terrifying stories comes from Jack, a fisherman who grew up hearing tales of the Kushtaka from his grandmother. Jack was a skeptic, a man of the outdoors who'd spent his life on Alaska's rivers. To him, the stories were just old folklore meant to scare kids into staying close to home. That all changed one evening when Jack had an encounter he would never forget. It was a clear, quiet evening, and Jack was fishing alone on a remote river. The only sound was the water lapping against the shore and the occasional splash of fish breaking the surface. As the sun began to set, Jack noticed something unusual on the opposite bank. A small otter was sitting there, perfectly still, staring at him. At first he thought nothing of it. Otters were common in the area. But as the minutes passed, the otter didn't move. It didn't play, didn't swim. It just sat there, watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The longer he stared back, the more uneasy he felt. Its eyes seemed too intelligent, too focused, almost human. Then it stood up. The otter rose onto two legs, its body stretching unnaturally tall. Its limbs were too long, its posture too upright. Jack swore the creature's eyes never blinked, never wavered as it stared directly into his. He said it felt like time had slowed, like the creature was holding him there with its gaze. Finally, his fight-or-flight instinct kicked in. He grabbed his gear and ran, his heart pounding as he fled to his boat. For years, Jack refused to return to that fishing spot. When he told the story to his son years later, He ended with a chilling warning. If you ever see an otter that doesn't move, don't wait to find out what it wants. Get out of there. And then there's Sarah, a mother who had her own horrifying encounter while camping with her two young children. They were staying near Wrangell, deep in the wilderness, far from any towns. Late one night, as Sarah stoked the fire outside their tent, she heard what sounded like her youngest daughter calling from the woods. "Mommy, help me," the voice cried. At first, she thought her daughter had wandered off, but when she checked the tent, both kids were sound asleep. Confused and frightened, she grabbed her flashlight and stepped toward the trees. The voice came again, louder this time. "Mommy, I'm here." Sarah's instincts told her to stop, but the voice was so familiar, so desperate. She shone her flashlight into the woods, scanning the underbrush. That's when she saw it, an otter crouched low near a fallen tree. But as she moved closer, the otter began to change. It stood up, its body twisting unnaturally, its limbs stretching far too long. Its glowing eyes locked onto hers, and Sarah froze. She described the creature as having a face that was neither fully human nor fully animal, but somewhere in between. Its mouth opened, and she heard the voice again, now layered with a low, guttural growl. Sarah grabbed her kids, locked them in the car, and stayed there until morning, gripping a knife in her trembling hands. When the sun rose, the creature was gone, but Sarah said she could still hear faint whispers as they packed up and drove away. Mike, a seasoned park ranger, had his own brush with the unexplained while patrolling near the Tongass National Forest. One night he heard what sounded like a woman crying for help deep in the woods. It was faint at first, but as he followed the sound, it grew louder, more frantic. He called out, "I'm coming! Where are you?" But there was no response, just the crying, leading him farther and farther from the trail. Finally, he reached a clearing and saw something standing by the river. At first, he thought it was a person, hunched and trembling. But as he got closer, the figure straightened. It was tall, with fur-covered limbs and a face that was disturbingly human-like. Its eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight, locking onto his. Mike described the fear as paralyzing, like his body refused to move. The creature tilted its head, studying him, before stepping back into the shadows and disappearing. When he returned to the area the next day with a team, they found no footprints, no signs of anyone being there, but Mike couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The Kushtaka aren't just stories, they're warnings. A reminder that the wilderness can be as mysterious as it is beautiful, and that some things are better left unexplored. So if you ever hear a voice calling your name in the woods, think twice before you follow it. It might not be what you think. Thanks for joining me on this eerie journey into Alaska's dark legends. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, stay curious, stay cautious, and stay safe. Fairbanks, Alaska, a frozen, isolated corner of the world where the cold sinks into your bones and the darkness seems endless. In the late 1970s, that darkness hid something far more sinister than the weather. It was called the Church of the Firstborn, a religious group that promised love, salvation, and purpose. But what it delivered was something out of a nightmare: control, manipulation, and terror. The church's leader, Brother Elijah, was a man with a voice that could command a room and eyes that seemed to see straight through you. People said he was chosen by God, but those who got too close would come to believe he was something else entirely. Sarah didn't know any of this when she first stepped into the church's gathering hall. She was just a lonely college student, new to Fairbanks and desperate for connection. The winters were brutally cold, and the nights dragged on forever. When her friend Emma invited her to a service, Sarah thought, "What's the harm?" The moment she walked in, she felt it, an energy, almost electric. The congregation smiled like they'd known her forever. They hugged her, called her sister, and asked deeply personal questions, but in a way that felt warm. Then Brother Elijah took the stage. His voice was calm but commanding, each word laced with authority. He spoke of a world outside that was corrupt, evil, and full of darkness. "Only here," he said, "can you find the true light." Sarah was drawn in. Who wouldn't be? In that room surrounded by people who radiated kindness and purpose, she felt like she belonged, like she was safe. But that feeling didn't last long. It started with the rules. At first, they seemed harmless: spend more time with the church, less with people outside. "Outsiders won't understand our mission," Emma told her. Then came the bigger sacrifices. Give up your possessions, your independence, even your doubts. "Doubt is the devil's work," Brother Elijah said. "If you trust me, you'll find salvation." Sarah wanted to trust him. She wanted to believe this was her place. But there was something unsettling about Elijah, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. And the longer she stayed, the more the cracks in the church's perfect facade began to show. Late at night, Sarah would hear chanting coming from the meeting hall, low and rhythmic. She asked Emma about it, but Emma's smile faltered for just a moment before she said, "It's nothing to worry about. Just trust the process." Sarah started to notice how afraid people seemed, afraid to speak out, afraid to step out of line. She saw members confess their sins in front of the entire congregation, shaking and crying as Elijah questioned them. And when someone questioned him, the punishment was brutal. They called it purification. Sarah called it torment. One night, she witnessed a man being forced to kneel on the cold floor for hours while the congregation surrounded him, chanting. Elijah's voice boomed, "We are saving his soul. He must be cleansed of his doubt." The man sobbed, but no one stepped forward to help him. Not even Sarah. But the real horror began when people started disappearing. At first, it was subtle. A face Sarah had seen every week was suddenly gone, their name never spoken again. When she asked Emma about it, Emma's eyes darted away. "They were too far gone to be saved," she whispered. "Brother Elijah had to let them go." "Let them go? Let them go where?" Sarah's breaking point came when she heard whispers about the church's archives, a locked room at the back of the compound. No one but Elijah and his inner circle were allowed inside. But late one night, when the compound was silent, Sarah's curiosity got the better of her. She crept into the building, her heart pounding, and picked the lock. Inside, she found records, hundreds of them. Names, dates, financial statements, proof that members had signed over everything they owned to the church. There were letters, too, desperate pleas from people who'd tried to leave but were silenced before they could escape. And then there were the surveillance logs, detailed notes on every member's movements, conversations, even private moments. Sarah's blood turned to ice. This wasn't a church. This was a prison. She tried to leave, but she never got the chance. Elijah found out what she'd done. The next morning, he stood before the congregation, calm and composed. "We have a traitor among us," he said, his eyes landing on Sarah. "She is infected with darkness, and we must save her soul." The congregation turned on her. People who had smiled at her, hugged her, called her sister, now looked at her with fear and hatred. They dragged her to the front of the room, chanting as Elijah placed his hands on her head. "You will repent," he whispered, his voice as cold as the Alaskan winter. Sarah thought it was the end, but someone on the outside had been watching. Caleb, a local man who'd always been suspicious of the church, had been quietly gathering evidence for months. When Sarah disappeared, he knew he had to act. With the help of former members and the authorities, Caleb launched a raid on the compound. It happened just before dawn. Police stormed the property, breaking down doors and freeing terrified members. Elijah tried to run, but he didn't get far. The records Sarah had found were enough to seal his fate. He was arrested, along with his inner circle. The Church of the Firstborn was finally exposed for what it was, a cult built on fear and control. But the nightmare didn't end there. For Sarah and the other members, the trauma lingered. It wasn't just what they had endured, it was the realization of how easily they had been manipulated. Sarah rebuilt her life piece by piece. She began working with other cult survivors, sharing her story to warn people about the dangers of blind trust and the seductive power of charismatic leaders. The compound is abandoned now, its halls empty, its secrets left to rot in the Alaskan cold. But the memory of what happened there still lingers, a shadow over Fairbanks, a haunting reminder of how darkness can hide in plain sight. So, the next time someone promises you salvation, remember this. Not everything that shines is light, and sometimes the brightest smiles hide the darkest truths.